It was produced, the Great Depression was produced by a failure of government, by a failure of monetary policy. It was produced by a failure of the Federal Reserve System to act in accordance with the intentions of those who established it. It was produced by a failure of the Federal Reserve System despite the presence of knowledge on the part of many of the people in the system about the right course of action.
The Roaring Twenties was a period of economic growth, jazz and carefree living for many. A decade of change when many Americans owned cars, radios and telephones for the first time. Prosperity was on the rise in cities and towns, and social change flavoured the air. The sentiment was, as is currently the case, stocks, or stonks as Reddit would say, only go up.
It drove stock prices up to irrational, even silly levels. Despite those crazy levels, as in all speculative booms, there were people who said, the stock market is right.
Of course, all good things come to an end.
There was something fundamentally wrong with this economy. Not only with the market, with the stock market, not only that stocks were grossly overvalued, but there were underlying problems with the economy, that this illusion of prosperity that had so captivated people for nearly a decade was indeed an illusion, and that the panic was a kind of inarticulate emotional recognition of that fact, because, in other words, it was grounded in something real.
The Fed is supposed to keep inflation and monetary policy stable. However, in the 1920s, they created huge quantities of money and cheap credit, which drove rapid expansion and a bubble. This bubble popped in October 1929, and the Fed then adopted tight monetary policy throughout the 1930s, creating a crash. Some go as far to say that the Great Depression was a government confiscation of wealth. Here's why. In 1900, the Gold Standard Act was passed. This act fixed the price of gold at $20.67 per troy ounce, where it remained until the Great Depression. In 1933, a month after taking office, FDR signed Executive Order 6102, dubbed the Great Gold Confiscation. FDR's executive order forced all Americans to turn in all their gold coins, bullion, and certificates to the Federal Reserve, redeeming them at $20.67 per troy ounce, in exchange for paper currency. Historians have speculated that the real reason for the gold confiscation was a bailout of the Federal Reserve Bank. Even FDR commented during one of his early fireside chats that gold obligations far exceeded the gold held by the US Treasury and the Federal Reserve.
Behind government currency, we have, in addition to the promise to pay, a reserve of gold and a small reserve of silver. Neither of them anything like the total amount of the currency.
After the public had turned in the majority of the gold, FDR artificially increased the price of gold to $35 per troy ounce, which amazingly instantly bolstered the Federal Reserve holdings. Starting in 1934, the Federal Reserve even updated the clause printed on currency bills, redeemable for gold with redeemable in lawful money. This innocuous act foreshadowed what was to come. It's also worth noting that it was the Fed's tight monetary policy which converted a bog-standard recession into a Great Depression.
At all times, there were people in Congress who were arguing that the Federal Reserve System should take a different course. At all times, there were outside commentators. One of the Canadian banks was particularly prescient, but there were other commentators who were pointing out the disastrous effects on the American economy of the restrictive policies that the Federal Reserve System was following.
Others say it's just a boom-bust cycle, a boom to make the sheeple produce, create, establish, then a bust to steal it from them at pennies on the dollar. Rinse and repeat. An intentional failure in order to create a crisis and pass laws to empower the government, which funnels wealth and property into the hands of the elite.
Despite the presence of knowledge on the part of many of the people in the system about the right course of action.
I personally think this is a ridiculous line of reasoning to say that the Fed intentionally caused the Great Depression. I mean, come on, as if an independent agency set up by a cabal of private bankers on a private island and officially passed when most of the Congress was away for Christmas in 1913 would collude in this way. Of course they aren't that power hungry. It's often worthwhile to look at the official story to at least rule out one possibility as to what actually happened.
Was a failure of private business. It was due to an overextension, over-speculation in the 1920s, or it was due to an excessive concentration of wealth in the hands of the wealthy at the expense of the poor in the 1920s, or it was due to speculative investment abroad, or whatnot. But it was a failure of private business, and government had to step in order to rescue private business from its own failure. Nothing could be farther from the truth.
But what about today?
It's also a period of enormous excitement about the stock market, where all kinds of ordinary people, not just the stock market professionals who'd always participated in Wall Street, but ordinary folk began to see Wall Street as a place to play, to grow rich quickly, a place that was largely risk-free. Therefore, the 20s in America is a period in which Wall Street, for the first time in its history, is associated with play culture.
Those who do not know history are destined to repeat it. For more compounded valuable content, subscribe and like.